All right, hi guys. I apologize for my voice and you having to bear with this not nice sounding narrative that I'm about to give on Sigmund chapters 12 and 13. But I think I have the flu. I didn't get my flu shot this year, which I always do, but I just never got around to it, which is kind of funny and ironic because it's sort of the idea that we start off chapter 12 seeing in that the conscience is merely just um, like a social construct based off of a series of learned punishers that help us to avoid bigger punishers. And so I think it's ironic because the flu shot's like this tiny little punisher that says, here, if you get this little poke in your arm, it might increase the likelihood that you'll avoid the bigger punisher of the flu down the road. So kind of ironic timing for that. Anyway, let's jump right in. I'm going to just outline the two chapters and then I will post a question in the thread. So anyway, we start off chapter 12 and we're talking about the idea of a conscience. And that's funny because really in our culture, we are very ingrained in thinking about the conscience as a thing, and it's a good thing. And we usually associate people who seem to have a stronger, more often used conscious as being better people, more like moral. We even have terms to describe people that appear to have like really good working conscience. We call them conscientious. So in this chapter, when Sigmund is essentially kind of taking that, deconstructing that whole notion that a conscience is this thing and that some of us have it, and that when we behave well, it's because we're following our conscience, and basically saying, no, this is a social construct based off of learned punishers and coercive control. That could be like a big knee-jerk reaction for people who, especially people who maybe pride themselves on being able to make highly moral or highly conscious decisions. Um, anyway, so we start off the chapter just kind of talking about what is it, and it's essentially just being able to like adaptively weigh options in order to avoid punishers, often sometimes an opposite of what the contingencies are that are pulling us. So what that actually looks like, I think of my son, because Sigmund talks a lot about young children and development of the conscience in this chapter. So I'm going to use my own kids as examples. So my son is 4, and one of the things we teach him is how to share, right? Sharing is ultimately altruistic, and others are more likely to want to socially engage with you if you are willing to share resources with them. It also increases the likelihood that resources will be shared with you, right? So that's a good thing. It's also a conscience thing, I think. So, for example, when he's playing with friends, we'll often coach him like, no, you need to share. People don't want to play if you can't share. Share. And oftentimes, like, the contingencies present for him maybe tell him not to. Like, why would I share? Because I would rather eat this whole snack and not part of it and give the other part to my friend. Or I'm enjoying this toy and my friend can play with a different one. Why would I want to share? And so by building that into him, we're basically asking for him to have some sort of hopeful delayed reinforcer or delay escape of punishment. So it's basically just this giant delay and making decisions based off of how can I behave in a way that's a delay, hopefully a delay to a bigger reinforcer or an avoidance from a bigger punisher. So, and that's not always bad. Society really depends on us to have quote unquote consciences. Like I depend every day. I'm just for funny reference, very small. I'm like 5'1". I'm the same size I was in literally 5th grade. So I rely on every day that people bigger than me, who are everybody, have a conscience that tells them to not try to attack me because they'd win, right? Or not to steal from me. We all are relying on the conscience of others in order for society to work. However, there's still bad guys, so we know this doesn't apply to everybody. And Sigmund starts to talk about, well, who doesn't this apply to? Those who have enough power and resources to avoid a punisher if they don't have a conscience. And he starts getting kind of even political in nature, saying that CEOs of large corporations can often behave in very corrupt ways because they have the resources to avoid punishers. We often like to think of our government leaders as that. A lot of people are very resistant to the government, thinking that they essentially are just able to escape punishment, that we're not, and that those with consciences are really it's really a measure to keep the weak and poor down, which is interesting because you know I can't afford a speeding ticket. My husband and I are teachers, and we have 2 kids and dogs and goats and a house and a mortgage and medical bills, and I can't afford a ticket, so I'm not going to speed. Somebody that's a millionaire probably doesn't care, and they're going to speed all over in their Lamborghini. So that's just a little example. So as we're moving on into chapter 13, kind of keeping in mind this whole idea of the conscience and like who does it impact and where did it begin from, we're now looking at what happens when even if we have a conscience that is telling us we could maybe avoid punishment. What do we do when punishment becomes unavoidable, and what are the side effects of that? So, Sidman is largely attributing much of mental health, and of course not all of it, because some of it is biological and etiology, but and we must consider that as behavior analysts. We must rule out biological medical causes, but much of the behaviors that we see that are associated with things that we would describe as anxiety and depression, even panic and suicide, often are results of unavoidable punishers or unavoidable shock. And how do we as a society respond to that? So, also, what does it do for industry and money and other people's benefits? So there's a lot to unpack in this chapter. So Sigmund kind of starts off asking, like, if we're giving intermittent shocks or punishers or something in observed behavior, wouldn't individuals or creatures react in ways as to try to avoid an unavoidable shock? The answer is no. If they know it's unavoidable, they actually really start to halt, especially when they get the SD that it's imminent. A lot of people, I guess it would maybe be the fight or flight or fright, they call mode, where you just freeze, fight, flight, or freeze, I think. A lot of it freeze, and it's a halting activity that Sidman has termed conditioned suppression. And it's basically a result of unavoidable shock or unavoidable punishers. So you see this a lot in people that are maybe like dealing with death. You'll see this, he says, on the battleground for soldiers, or even people that maybe are facing terminal illness, where it's just like everything stops. I often refer to it as like self-destruct or imploding in a sense. And on a much larger scale, sometimes I'll do that when I become overwhelmed. So, and I see this with my students when they become overwhelmed. One of the accommodations I give is to chunk tasks. And so sometimes if there's too much of something that seems aversive, instead of just like dealing with it, you freeze. The other thing he says that can happen, some people don't freeze, some people respond even worse. He was saying some people actually have an increase in activity, and that can be maybe seen as anxiety. That's typically me. I'm an anxious person, and I do things to avoid perceived punishers. But I kind of, in that example, thought of somebody that's getting arrested, and they just like are spitting on officers or kicking them, and they're just like accruing all of these charges, but they're probably just like, well, I'm in trouble anyway, so who cares? So there is a lot of negative association with like coercion and punishment, especially when we know. And he was giving the example of like the delay to punishment and just the loom and the gloom that we sit under, and that almost depression or anxiety that we experience when we're waiting for a punisher that we know is inevitable. And sometimes we just have a lack of adaptive behavior. We just can't adapt to it. And just sort of the interesting counterbalance that comes with that. So anyway, he didn't really wrap up the chapter as much as he has in his other chapters. So I'll be really interested to go on to chapter 14 and see what he has to say. But I did find it interesting just to think of the conscious as sort of just like an understanding of contingencies and either having a delayed reinforcement or hopefully an avoidance of punishers, as well as then what happens with unavoidable punishers and the way that they actually really can impact kids and humans. It makes me think how I'll respond with my kids. So I'm going to try to stop talking, although I know you probably all just are loving hearing my crackly voice. But I will post a comment, like a topic of comments in this thread.